It's my name is Nichol. It's an honor to be with you. I have actually been here many times before. Sometimes smaller groups. It's nice to see the great activism here in Rowan County. I love talking to these Democratic rooms. First of all, just can I ask you to do this? Look over there on that wall. You see that youngish, thin-looking black man? Does anybody miss Barack Obama? It might take Democrats to show that a president can be decent and admirable and inspiring and can lift us up and not lie all day long every damn day and not be a cheat and not be a thief and not work to destroy the American democratic experience. So just remember who we got over here on the wall. I work at the University of North Carolina. I bring you greetings from Chapel Hill. I was at the Dean Dome 2 nights ago. We got a new point guard that ought to lift your heart. Yeah. Even if you're not rooting for Chapel Hill, we got a point guard that'll lift your hearts. And if you're rooting for Duke, I feel sorry for you. I say that about bringing welcome from Chapel Hill, but I'm also asked to tell you that I don't speak for Chapel Hill. The university I love takes great solace when I give it opportunity to distance itself from me. I don't know why that's true. It doesn't seem necessary to give you that qualifier after they closed down our poverty center and closed down the civil rights center. I'm barely allowed to speak at the University of North Carolina, much less for it. But it's good to be here. I'm going to talk about something that's not fun, not happy, not a source of joy and excitement. I'm going to talk to you about poverty in North Carolina. Jeffrey's great. He asked me to do that. So it'll change the mood, and I regret that. But part of what we're trying to do here, think about, is what's at stake in this state. What it means to have rooms like this dominate and take back the politics of North Carolina. And that's nowhere more explicit than it is with poor people, with low income folks. I do want to say, though, I'm going to talk to you about poverty in North Carolina. It's sort of hard not to say something about Washington, D.C., home of the Republican leadership, where, as I read it a few days ago, first we heard there is no quid pro quo. I got real doubts whether Donald Trump knows what quid pro quo means, but apparently there's no quid pro quo. But then we learned, with conclusive proof, that there's this offered White House trip that would require an inspection, investigation of the Bidens. So that meant that there was explicitly, clearly, a quid pro quo. Then the Republicans said, well, there's got to be 2 quid pro quos. 1 is not enough. So then we had last week uncontestable proof of a second massive quid pro quo. The military funds desperately needed by a weakened nation. And now the Republicans say, well, 2 quid pro quos is not enough, and it doesn't matter anyway because it's not an impeachable offense. Let me just say that if this is not an impeachable offense, I'm a constitutional lawyer. No offense ever committed by an American president has been anywhere close to the centrality of this as an impeachable offense. If these folks say it's not enough, just think this through with me just for 1 second. The President of the United States says he can use the power of the United States government to try and force, coerce, extort foreign nations into participating on his side in our elections. If that's not enough, nothing conceivably could be, because that is an end of democracy. If the President of the United States can use the power of the federal government to force foreign entities to participate against his adversaries in our elections, that's literally the end of the American democracy. So all these folks in the Republican caucus up there, the ones you're running against, say, oh no, I'm okay with this. Do whatever you want, Mr. President. Lie, cheat, steal, destroy democracy. I'm with you. You can count on me. That's what's at stake. This is the clearest case of impeachment ever presented in American history. And we've got an entire Republican caucus up there in Washington who says they duck and they say, don't talk to me. That's what we face. That's what's at stake now every day. But I'm not going to talk to you about politics. I'm going to talk to you about poverty. And you can't separate poverty and politics, not in North Carolina. North Carolina has a lot of challenges. Its greatest, in my view, is wrenching poverty. Poverty amidst plenty in one of the most economically vibrant states of the richest nation on earth, the richest nation in human history. We've also become the most unequal nation on earth. Thomas Piketty, the great international equality scholar, wrote last year that inequality in the United States right now, this day, is higher than in any other society at any time in the past, anywhere in the world. First, worst ever. Despite everything that we pledge allegiance to, equality and liberty and justice for all, we have become the richest, the poorest, and the most unequal nation in the world. That's just for national perspective. North Carolina, as a lot of you guys know, is worse. We have among the highest poverty rates and child poverty rates and hunger rates and child food insecurity rates and rates of the uninsured and now concentrated poverty rates in the country. Almost a quarter of our kids are poor. Almost 40% of our children of color live in poverty. Richest nation on earth, almost 40% of our kids of color. A great indictment of any society. Greensboro, High Point are tagged by the federal government most years as being the hungriest cities in the United States. Right here. North Carolina has among the 5 hungriest rates for babies, kids 5 and under. Charlotte, as some of you know, 2 years ago was found by a Harvard study to have the worst income mobility in the United States. In other words, if a kid is born poor in Charlotte, you're more apt to stay that way than anywhere else in America. Those are dreary numbers, horrifying. But they never really make their way into our public discourse. They don't debate these matters in Raleigh. are in Washington, D.C., if having the highest rate of hungry babies is not enough to make it on your agenda, I understand different folks may have different policies for dealing with it. But if having the highest percentage of hungry babies is not enough to make it on your agenda, I can't fathom what would be. But that's where we sit. Poverty's victims are often invisible to us, sometimes purposely so. I used to work a lot when I was younger with a great United States Senator named Paul Wellstone. Wellstone used to say, one of the largest problems in American life is we turn our gaze away from those locked at the bottom. We do it circumstantially, we do it intentionally. I try in this book to pull the curtain back just a little bit. The method is simple. I use the words and stories of people in North Carolina living in poverty. They tell it, I don't. Hoping to move past the sort of dry statistics that I just gave you, horrifying as they are. I can't summarize these stories, but so what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to talk to you about three of them. I'll tell you the stories, and then I'm going to tell you what we have done in North Carolina on Jones Street in response. Little spoiler alert, we have these great, powerful challenges of poverty and inequality, and we have chosen to wage the stoutest war on poor people ever embarked upon in the last half century in the United States. That's what we've done. That's what we fight against. So, 2 or 3 stories. First one is from Hickory. Y'all know Hickory, 50 miles from here. It's hard not to be taken with Hickory, North Carolina, at least on first blush. Nestled into the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, west of the urban Piedmont. Hickory's 40,000 residents can boast of broad avenues, a quaint city center, welcoming neighborhoods, massive and well-attended churches. Hickory has the look of an older, easier Carolina. Even the name appeals. It's been recognized as an all-American city. Reader's Digest designated it some years ago one of the 10 best places in the country to raise a family. But Hickory also has, in the last 15 years, experienced immensely trying economic times. The pressures and alterations of the global economy hit hard. Furniture and textile jobs, the core of Hickory's economy, disappeared with NAFTA. In 2000, think about this, Hickory's unemployment rate was under 2%. It was like 1.4%. I didn't know anybody ever had a 1.4% unemployment rate. But by 2010, a decade later, it had risen to 16%. The sharpest increase in the United States for any metropolitan area. So a small, sort of bucolic manufacturing town had become an economic disaster zone. For the first time in the last decade, homelessness has become a daunting problem in Hickory. Salvation Army Shelter of Hope is pressed well beyond its capacity. As a result, tonight, some 250 wounded souls live in the woods surrounding town. They patch together makeshift cardboard lean-tos and dilapidated tents, keeping a wary eye for the police and complaining neighbors. In summer, the camps bear the oppressive markers of the South. Intense heat, draining humidity, sudden rainstorms, relentless mosquitoes, yellow jackets, gnats, and snakes. In the winter, snow and frost pose distinct and direct dangers. More than one struggler has perished against the cold. About a third of those living out are women. Some are kids, though their parents struggle hard to hide them, fearing abuse and neglect proceedings. Roger Cornett and 15 or so volunteers from the Open Door Homeless Relief Project, which is run out of a tiny Baptist church in Conover. They spend much of their days and nights and almost all of their meager resources trying to keep people living in the woods of Hickory whole, safe, well, and alive. Cornett is a 65-year-old retired businessman who suffers from a debilitating neuromuscular disorder. He doesn't look the part of the heart-on-the-sleeve do-gooder as he crisscrosses the county in a battered pickup truck, NRA sticker prominently displayed. But Cornett and his cohorts venture into often dangerous campgrounds, distributing tents, tarps, food, cook stoves, utensils, clothing, portable heaters, even dog food. I couldn't believe people were being left to live like animals in my own county, he said. A thin man in his 30s, Bill Stock, explains that a lot of us would be dead out here without Roger and his people. You learn not to look vulnerable. A woman has to get with a man or she'll get hurt. Making the point, Cornett introduces me to a lesbian couple living on the wood lines. Janet Teal was raped, beaten, stabbed 2 days earlier. She shows me 13 stab wounds. The sight is sickening. Cornett and one of his friends had helped to subdue the assailant. I don't know how long I'm going to last out here, she tells me. Dorothy Edwards, who's worked closely with Cornett for many years, speaks of a young couple in their early 30s, Mark and Christina. She can't get out of her mind. They both lost their jobs when their respective employers closed during the recession. Eventually they sold their cars and they lost their apartment. When they could no longer afford even the cheapest hotel, they had to go to the woods. Christina, in tears, explained, "This is new to me. Please don't pay attention. I got to get used to it, I know. I'm sorry for all the blubbering. But I've never even been camping before." When we talked, Marcia Stimson, 47, reported that she was living in the Salvation Army shelter for the third time. "I'm one of their best bell ringers," she said, a top producer. But she recounted a hard cycle. "I work a little bit, save some money. I try to get some housing. Like I was working over at Healthy Home Market in Hickory, but it closed and I lost my apartment. At first I liked the thought of living outside," she said. "I always enjoyed camping, but she quickly learned you have to be secretive all the time. If people find out where you are, they'll call the cops or steal your stuff, or worse." She lived most of the time with a friend named Dave, so other men generally left her alone. But even then she didn't feel safe. "To tell you the truth," she told me, "in the middle of the night, I find raccoons even more frightening than men." Stimson packed all her belongings in a trash bag every morning, took them with her so no one would steal them. Then when I come back late in the evening, I would sneak past the mobile homes near the road, because if they saw her, they'd report her, of course. The morning wasn't as bad. I'm an early riser, she said. I get out of the camp by 4:45. Then you don't have to worry so much about being seen. I was shocked, she said, when I first came to Hickory and saw there were hundreds of people living in the woods. Lots living in cars. I never thought I'd feel fortunate to be one of the ones living in a car. Lots couch hopping, moving place to place. "There are some amazing people here," she said, like Roger and his Open Door folks. "But mostly no one can stand the sight of homeless people. We give them the creeps." Stimson has lived at the edge in Hickory since 2013. The existence debilitates. It also dehumanizes. In words I haven't been able to forget, she explained, and I quote, "When you've lost your job and lost your savings and lost your home and lost your car, and then I even lost my cat, who was very dear to me. I know that sounds funny or stupid," she said. "But when you lose everything, you lose your sense of being a person. You lose your own independent identity. You lose your own space to fill in the world." it gets hard to remember you're still a human being, or that you have a chance at a decent life, or that you deserve one, or that you are worthy of existence. That's Hickory. Second, hunger. High Point's, I said, 35 miles up the road, hungriest city in the United States. Clyde Fitzgerald, who some of you might have known, who passed away last year, ran the big food bank system over here. Clyde said, hunger's a tragedy in North Carolina. It doesn't have to happen. It occurs because we choose to tolerate it, and it'll keep happening in North Carolina until we refuse to tolerate it. It's a real crisis, a matter of great and surpassing urgency. I don't know how people can so readily ignore it. It's absurd and indefensible in the supposed breadbasket of the world that we let people starve. In North Carolina, hunger doesn't manifest itself like it does in Africa, with people falling to the ground and literally dying before your eyes. For many of Fitzgerald's neighbors, he said, that's the vision of hunger that they have and that they prefer to keep in their minds. They believe there's no actual hunger here because they don't see it. Fitzgerald said, I always tell them, okay, you say there's no hunger here. Hey, you got 20 minutes? I got my car. Sit down. I'll take you to see it. Every single time they decline. They don't want to see it. I asked Jill Bullard, one of the North Carolina's great heroes on hunger, about the frequent claim from politicians and commentators that terms like food insecurity and food hardship are padded and meaningless. We have been told on the floor of the North Carolina legislature that there is no actual hunger in North Carolina. These standards are invented to justify needed government programs. Bullard tells me she's speechless in the face of such stupidity. There are 120,000 children in her service area in Durham who receive either one or sometimes 2 meals a day at school. If these kids didn't receive those subsidies, a very high percentage of them would get nothing to eat at all because their parents can't provide it. If the school programs were eliminated or attacked, like the president wants to do, we would have a hunger disaster like we have never imagined in the United States. North Carolina already pays a huge price, she says, for hunger. In our schools, in our hospitals, in our prisons. If we were to eliminate a system of assistance that is already way too thin, like these folks want to do, it would be unimaginable. So when folks quibble with definitions like food insecurity, they miss the gigantic issue right before their eyes. I asked her about political and religious leaders who claim that the moral or spiritual high ground now is to demand a sort of tough love, refusing to aid or abet those living in hunger and poverty. Bullard, who's a minister herself, says, I wait for the thunderbolts when I hear that talk. This harshness message is such a misinterpretation of the demands of justice and the demands of Christianity. Jesus chose to be among the poor, she said. He didn't seek out the wealthy and the prosperous. He would say to us now, go back and find the poor like I did. That anyone can claim that our present harshness is consistent with being a Christian nation is utterly baffling to them. Maybe they ought to read the New Testament. Alan Briggs is the chairperson of the food bank system in North Carolina. He puts the challenge plainly. The gap between what food banks can provide and the depth of the hunger we face in North Carolina is gigantic. It can't possibly be bridged. I ask parents to think when they sit in the line to drop off their kids in the morning at the school about the fact that about 3 of those 10 kids is living in hunger, can't get enough to eat. And then I ask them to remember all the problems that hunger triggers. Harm to health, harm to cognitive ability, harm to learning, harm to the ability to concentrate. But in fighting hunger, Allen says, our hardest battle is actually one of awareness. To most Tar Heels, hunger is out of sight and out of mind. And if people do find out about it, they think the scale is so large, a quarter of our kids, that they just turn away. Why isn't it a public issue, he wonders? It's absolutely absent from our public discourse, from our political discussions. It's not even the elephant in the room. We act as if there isn't an elephant. I wish I had the ability to change that, Rick says. It's a great responsibility to speak with and for those who don't otherwise have a voice. It's hugely frustrating not to be able to transform the public's perception of the crushing problem that we face. The people who suffer from intense hunger in North Carolina don't have a platform. They aren't part of the mainstream conversation. Hunger isn't part of it. It's just left out. We might be willing to donate some cans or some money or a little bit of our time at one of our churches once or twice a year. And those things are really important, he says. But very few of us are willing really to look hard at the significance of the problem we face. We're not willing to haul that gigantic iceberg out and have a look at it, to see what's sailing towards us. We remain unaware. It's like we prefer it that way. That's what keeps me up at night, he says. The iceberg that's coming that we don't see. Third and last, Kinston. Now, this is at least 200 miles away, so not so close to home. Though, you do know, I think, that East Spencer is one of the stoutest food deserts in North Carolina and in the United States.
Yes.
I spent a lot of time in East Spencer. I know a lot of you have, and it is dangerously close driving in this morning. Especially to, I don't want to cast any aspersions. I love Food Line, but isn't Salisbury the home of Food Line?
Yes.
It's awful close to a food desert over there in East Spencer. But I won't mention that. Kinston. Dr. Pradeep Gurungam is a heart specialist in Kinston. Lenore County is one of the state's poorest, you know that. The doctor's had a big city set of options, but he prefers the quiet, friendly life of eastern North Carolina. He's got a thriving practice as a heart doctor. He selflessly includes a potent commitment to impoverished patients who are uninsured and can't pay the fare. They are, he says, typically hardworking folk. They struggle economically. Waiters, maintenance workers, cooks, laborers, retail employees, ironically home health care workers. He says as a heart doctor, he tries to see his poorest patients on a monthly basis because they tend to be at the greater risk of dying. The failure to expand Medicaid, he says, has had a devastating impact on his patients. The most wrenching of those occurred last year when one of his patients, who made about $10,000 a year working in a local diner, faced severe dangers of heart failure from a troubling genetic abnormality. Dr. A had treated her initially in the emergency room, of course, at Lenore Memorial. He was able to stabilize her and send her home, but her heart remained weak. She was in her early 60s. Her sister had died from the same malady. She needed a defibrillator, which for an uninsured patient could cost over $70,000. She couldn't get coverage on the open market because she didn't have enough money. She couldn't qualify for the subsidies of the Affordable Care Act because she was too poor after the Republicans got finished with it. Dr. A saw her for several months, but he was unable to secure the defibrillator. As a result, the waitress died. We could have saved her, he said. I treated her for free. The medicine she needed didn't cost much, so I paid for them myself. But we couldn't get the device that she had to have. She'd be alive today if we accepted Medicaid expansion. That's a simple fact, he told me. People don't like to hear it, but it's the simple truth. She'd be alive today if she lived in any of the 36 American states who have accepted Medicaid expansion. She died because she was a Tar Heel. She died because she's from North Carolina. Now, I'm trying in this book mainly to sort of paint a picture of poverty. But you can't study poverty, as I said, and ignore what's been happening in North Carolina the last 7 years. The greatest war on poor people to occur in the last half century. Think about that for a second. Not a war on poverty, a literal war on poor people. Low-income people have learned that there's one thing worse than, I'm sad to say, has sometimes been the Democratic tradition of ignoring poor people, and that is your government can target poor people, try to make them miserable. We've now become expert at that. What the New York Times calls North Carolina's pioneering work in bigotry. Looking at these hardships, since 2013, I just want to give you a little list. Our General Assembly has done this. First, rejected proffered Medicaid coverage for 465,000 poor Tar Heels. Though the feds would carry almost the entirety of the tab, costing us billions of healthcare dollars, hundreds of millions of tax dollars, tens of thousands of jobs every year, and as you know, already some rural hospitals. But worst of all, as Harvard proved 4 years ago, over 1,000 poor Tar Heels die every year as a result of this choice. These Republicans cannot tell you why they do it. And can you imagine being in the State House, casting a vote, which means 1,000 of your sisters and brothers are going to die, and you can't even come up with a reason? Why can't they come up with a reason? Because they don't want to say the true reason. I ain't voting for anything that guy pushed through. That's not a very appealing justification to someone whose husband has died as a result of this choice. At about the same time that we did that, we enacted the largest cut to an unemployment in American history, taking us from the middle of the pack to the country's stingiest effort. Last place. The next year, we became the first state, the only state still in American history, to abolish its earned income tax credit, raising the taxes of working families making about $35,000 a year. No one else has exercised the high honor of so intentionally riding the backs of its poor folks. We then enacted 3 years of income and sales tax reforms that gave huge cuts to the top 5% and raised the taxes. I'm not saying they just gave them a little increase. They raised the taxes of the bottom 40%. We removed over 100,000 poor people, qualifying poor people, from the federal food stamp program, most of them kids. And of course, it saved us not a penny, because all the money comes from the federal government. But our legislator said, I don't want the federal government putting any bread on the table of poor Tar Heel children. We required drug testing for Work First recipients, and then we kept at it after it was proven to be a colossal waste of money. We kept at it because it still served our purpose, humiliating poor people. We ended the state's entire appropriation to legal aid. We made it nearly impossible to waive fees for indigent criminal defendants in criminal cases. We cut child care subsidies. We slashed the dental care program for poor kids in the public schools. We made it illegal for cities to raise the minimum wage. Once again, we repealed the North Carolina Access to Civil Justice Act so that we could match the repeal of the North Carolina race discrimination provisions. I could go on, but I don't have the stomach for it. I'm not feeling that good this morning. I got plenty of stomach, but I don't have the stomach for that shit. So we give our legislators take a lot of bragging rights to the ALEC conferences. So they can explain what Senator Ralph Hayes now correctly boasts to be the most right-wing legislative record in the United States. We've been offered various theories to justify it. Trickle-down economics, necessary generosity to job creators, examples of what John Kenneth Galbraith called man's oldest exercise in moral philosophy, the search for a superior moral justification for selfishness. The frank truth is, if the exclusions and indignities of American poverty and race are right, then our Constitution is wrong. If the debilitations of those locked at the bottom that I've described are acceptable, then our scriptures are wrong. If these denials of equal citizenship and humanity are permissible, we pledge allegiance to a cynical illusion, not to a foundational creed. And I think we know it. It's like Lyndon Johnson said one time. We may not know everything, but we know the difference between chicken shit and chicken salad. Now, Johnson wasn't always crude. He was just almost always crude. Like a lot of you, I spent my youth protesting Lyndon Johnson. He horrified in war. He was this big, complicated, inconsistent, hypocritical, larger-than-life Texan. I'm from Mesquite, Texas myself. He'd holler at you, wave his arms, sweat on you, spit on you. I don't know why I'm drawn to it. What are you laughing at? But Johnson also taught that American poverty touches both our personal conscience and our national mission. Under circumstances not enough unlike our own, he said this: rarely in any time does an issue lay bare the secret heart of America itself. Rarely are we met with the challenge not to our growth or our abundance or our security, but rather to the values and purposes and meaning of our beloved nation. And should we defeat every enemy, and should we double our wealth and conquer the stars and be unequal to this task, then we would have failed as a people. For with a country as with a person, what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his soul? What is a man profit? So we are in this fight. You, me, all of us. We could wish it weren't so. We could wish it wasn't as challenging as it is, that there weren't such forces of wealth and power and privilege arrayed against us, that it was easier sledding, more certain of success. But the apostles of the American democracy, some who have come from this room and others like it, they faced tougher roads before. I am pretty sure that Fannie Lou Hamer didn't do an opinion poll before she started the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And as I recall, Mrs. Parks didn't conduct a focus group before she sat down for freedom. Cesar Chavez didn't ask if he would be praised or lauded when he launched his famed hunger strike. He said instead, si se puede. This is not the first time people of great courage and heart have been called upon to fight for justice against the odds. So we gather in this room. We ask even more powerfully that you enroll your spirits, that you enlist your hearts to make this defining cause your own. To enlist because somewhere we read, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal. And somewhere we read that we are one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And somewhere we read that history will judge us on the extent to which we've used our gifts to lighten and enrich the lives of our fellows. And somewhere we read, of course, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And somewhere we read, think of this, we ought to believe the things that we teach our children. Believe them and make them real. And somewhere we read, of course, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But it's up to us to be the arc benders. And somewhere we read, lots of folks in this room did, whenever you did these things for the least of these, you did them for me. And that same group read, you reap what you sow. And somewhere we read that the pursuit of justice and the pursuit of happiness can be as one. They march not in opposite directions, but hand in hand. And somewhere we read, no, we are not satisfied with this. We are not accommodated to it. We're not going to accept it. And we will not be satisfied till justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Congratulations on your work, and thanks for letting me spend a minute.